So our next talk will be Displacement, Expressing Identity Through Discomfort by Lee Cope.
Love it when a plan comes together. Hello, everybody. I am, as I think I've mentioned to several people today, in the last couple of days, I am professionally Lee, but everybody in this room is probably going to end up calling me V or Vel for the foreseeable future, and that's fine. So my topic today is on displacement and queer identities formed and communicated with other people through the medium of discomfort and media that makes you anxious. First off, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Wallamadigal clan of the Darug Nation on whose lands I am presenting. I pay respects to their elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Bunwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, on whose lands this research was conducted and this paper was written. Now, let me say thank you all for coming to this talk. I'm actually really excited to give this one because this is a bit of a pet topic for me. It's really great to be able to talk about games. They're just so fun, aren't they? No, that won't be the only bad joke for this presentation. Strap in, everybody. Today, we are going to be discussing, by which I mean I'm going to be monologuing about, types of gameplay other than fun, and the ways that queer art leverages deliberately uncomfortable and disconcerting experiences in order to express ideas that themselves can be fundamentally disconcerting and displacing. Which is the button? How do buttons work? Hey, that's going to work. All right, cool. Where were we? I'll be talking about a game I've been working on with this in mind, and the research outcomes so far, by which I mean I showed it to some of my friends and a couple of them went, cool. I will be spoiling the game entirely and in all of its aspects, so apologies if that matters to you. So I would say that games are a relatively new medium, except that that's a damn lie. Games have been around in some form or another since we've been a tool-using species, and that's just the ones that we can find archaeological evidence for. When we say a lot of times in these types of presentations that games are a new medium, most of the time we actually mean video games. And we also mean that it's only recently that study of games has begun to be conducted with, dare I say it, seriousness. Two of the biggest recent advances, though, and together I think these provide a solid chunk of the reason why there is the perception that studies of games have taken off recently, are that first, video games are being studied not only as their own medium, but as a quote-unquote art form. Until very recently, games were precluded from that category by dint of being the new media on the block and therefore the conservative punching bag of the day. And in the process, video games are sort of dragging tabletop and board games along with them into the discourse of the ludonarrative. And second, that play is being recognized as having effects and benefits on adults, not just being the purview of children and the childish. Together, this has opened up studies in the field of game design, tying mechanical design to play experience, which is what I mean when I say ludonarrative. Finding theories of media analysis that take into account the mechanical and interactive elements of game design, as well as the narrative elements that are present in other forms of media. It would be remiss of me here not to mention the overlap in discussing games and interactive theatre presentations, LARPs, that sort of thing, in particular overlap. But there's only so much time in this presentation and you're all going to get very bored of me talking about games anyway, so we're just going to leave that topic aside for another presentation. Many of these discussions, though, can end up quite normative in two important ways. Games, because of video games, so all games are tarred with the same kind of brush by extension, as I said before, are the new media on the block. And one of the big things that people have said sort of about games in defense of games in an attempt to not be analyzed by the people that want to look at the games and say, hey, why is this? Why are we doing this? Is this problematic? Is that games are, quote, just for fun. It's just a game. Why are you taking this so seriously? It's a symptom partially also of games finding their feet, so to speak, finding their analytical language, finding the ways that that overlap happens between the interactive and the private, the narrative that is told by the developers and the way that people process that narrative when they're actually sitting at the table with their friends, in front of the computer, in front of the board, however they happen to be playing the game. This results first in game studies bending over backwards to dissect and describe fun in ways that include a variety of experiences, but in a way that can still be pushed back into that fun bucket. Very famously, one of the theories around gameplay has been the motivations of gameplay. One famous list runs social, so playing with friends, World of Warcraft guilds, fantasy, the ability to step into another world, a character's shoes, your classic RPG, I'm playing as a person. Abnegation, so flow state games that require you to sort of shut off higher brain functions and just focus and mechanically execute without other input from thought in a conscious sort of way. Destruction, so griefing and messing with other players in the game space, messing with the world, can also mean speed running, rule breaking and that sort of thing, antagonizing the game design itself. Exploration, so getting into a new world and finding out all of the little nooks and crannies that the game designers put into it. Challenge, so this is your rage games, your difficult games, a lot of your old Nintendo 64, Nintendo hard games designed so that the gameplay time would be extended simply by the fact that they were just awful to beat. And all of these things theories contend are fun in isotopes, different variations. In many ways, it's a very understandable struggle. After all, what is most academia but the process of finding and creating language with which we can inform each other about our experiences and thus find some consensus on the status of the world? You can tell I'm still a student because I can still say that with a straight face. That search for language is laudable in that it is a search for a way to communicate knowledge to each other concisely, to compare knowledges, hopefully constructively. It should also be noted that these constructions of fun and play center white Western perspectives, often at the expense of non-white, Indigenous, non-Western narratives and formulations of play, though that is an entirely different presentation that would fit really well at this conference, but I unfortunately am not going to be able to give as a subset of this presentation. The second is that in the twin desire to celebrate fun as valuable in and of itself, and also allow that games can be confronting, an important side of gameplay is being ignored. Gameplay as a safe space to elicit and experience negative emotions. The most obvious examples are some Scandinavian LARPs where participants play out scenes of, for example, cannibalism, brink play for those that are more interested in looking in more detail, researcher Jorgensen, in a place where there are rules surrounding participation and there are restrictions on potential outcomes. But there are also, in the academic discussion, many pages are being dedicated to things like understanding toxic gaming environments, all of those online environments where people are turning off their headphones, turning off their mics, not interacting outside the physical characters in order to avoid just the deluge of abuse and slurs and whatever other nastiness is being aimed at them. But only recently, and I mention this in particular from personal experience at recent Digger Australia conferences, the academic discussion has begun to ask the question of what role games with, say, griefing as a core mechanic are playing for the people who persistently come back to them for the experience not just of griefing, but of being griefed. Griefing here, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, is the practice of going into a game and deliberately destroying other people's work. For example, joining a Minecraft server, luring a creeper over to someone's house, and then detonating the creeper in order to destroy what they've built. Games like Rust, Ark Survival Evolved, that sort of thing, have a community where people deliberately play in order to grief other people, and do genuinely see griefing as part of the gameplay experience, something that they go specifically into. There's been some very good studies coming out of DIGRA, people saying things like, yeah, I go in there to be griefed. It's not fair for me not to expect griefing in return. If I want my fun, I have to give other people their fun as well. Or that's part of the gameplay experience for me. I am grieved, and now I get to come up with petty revenge strategies, and I find fun in that. These kinds of situations where aggressive, antagonistic play is in fact making a good game rather than being a failure of community management haven't really entered the discussion. Because in trying to say that, yes, fun is important and games are fun, and in reacting against stereotypes of games as inherently harmful pursuits, academically and socially, we are somewhat reluctant to discuss the ways that, yeah, no, actually, sometimes we want to have an environment in which we can cause harmless harm, if that term can even be applied. It's here that I'm going to divert the topic sideways and bring us into the other half of the theory discussion, the relevance of queer theory to this search for framework. Helen Palmer, in Queer Defamiliarization, discusses queer theory thus: the multifarious and rapidly evolving disciplines of queer theory and gender studies seek to affirm the non-normative in such a way that transcends unhelpful binaries and permits infinite variations and permutations of experience, maintaining a necessarily paradoxical relationship between resistance to and desire for categorization. In many ways, the simple fact that games have not yet found their theory of everything in regards to their capacity to make meaning means that they are extremely well placed to be practical grounds for queering narratives and expressing queer narratives. This formulation of queering as the deliberate placing of meaning in between frameworks and as a negotiation between frameworks rather than situated within them feels important, particularly to the study of play, and particularly the way that meaning can be made playfully, using the systems of a game on top of and integrated with the narrative elements of the game, expressing things that could not be expressed by one or the other alone. Allow me to dig into what I mean by that a little bit. So, speaking from personal experience again for a moment, in many ways, the experience of embracing queerness is somewhat like performing a trust fall into Charybdis. Scylla may or may not be present. It is exhilarating to deliberately embody uncertainty and fluidity, to see the new options and paths made available by the choice to be unexpected, but equally willingly foregoing that level of security in one's static identity. The best I can describe that is, yeah, it's kind of like staring into the rushing, gnawing void. Why is this not working? There we go. Queer Studies acknowledges this as part of the fundamental work of queering. This work is to examine dominant structures and find ways of existing in between them, to position the self not as a location, but as a negotiation between intersections. Games are uniquely positioned. I use this term not as people usually mean it, as in best positioned. I should be clear, I do mean unique in both a literal and value neutral sense, in that baked into the discussion of game design currently is the discussion of the way that games systems, game mechanics, support or negate particular experiences. We discussed the way that the existence of the Phoenix Down, a revival mechanic used in fights, robs the narrative death of one of the characters of Final Fantasy of its poignancy. Why didn't we just use a Phoenix Down? I have like 6 in my inventory. It works on everything else. On the other hand, one of the often praised moments of the second Portal game is when the game verbally asks the character to say a word in order to prove to the entity speaking to you that you are able to respond. And you get a little pop-up that says, press A to say apple. Press spacebar to say apple. Spacebar, in fact, is the jump button. And not only is this a moment of humor within the game's framework, but it is also entwining that action of teaching the player what the spacebar does in this context while also setting that tone and setting the expectation that, yes, the mechanics are going to be used as part of the game experience. You are forced to focus on these mechanics in an embodied way. It establishes the actions that player takes as an inextricable and meaningful part of the game narrative. Games that intentionally and deliberately play with these layers of the narrative as presented and the mechanics, I contend, are queering the game space. Helen Palmer talks about this as defamiliarization, the method by which queering is achieved by deliberately shunting people out of their habitual patterns of thought. To reassess something, to perceive something in a new light, to think that the game will say apple and to jump instead, is an inherently queer act of perceiving entirely without habitual categorization and in that thing's totality. And the act of layering systems on each other such that they each highlight what is unseen in the other, in their counterpart, can be a hugely powerful method of such shunting. In order to explore this, I created a game. Well, full disclosure, I am creating a game. I am presenting today initial findings from the prototype and indicating the direction that I'll be taking the project. This is the intro screen of Talk to Me. It's a text adventure developed in Twine using the Harlow language. Narratively, it follows the path of a nameless, ungendered protagonist returning home for an unspecified reason, as so many indie games want to do. The choices of the player around whether to reconnect with the character's slightly estranged family and friends, or whether to let those connections wither, form the central focus of the game. Ostensibly, the mechanics are the same as any text adventure game of its kind. The player interacts with the game by reading text, and at the end of each passage selects the text option that most represents the actions they desire to take in the game. The main engagement with the game is in the role play, to interact with the narrative and to co-create the story with the designer. But of course, I wouldn't be talking about it in this presentation if it were that simple. The text adventure game is a relatively restrictive form of play. With only the text and set responses, the player is locked into very specific choices. There is no way to explore the environment beyond what has been written into the game with the clickable options. The player is specifically locked into role-playing a very specific character or one of a specific subset of characters, which are likewise predetermined by the designer. There is a specific kind of suspension of disbelief. That's not exactly the right word, but for want of a better one, that is inherent to these games. The player needs to inhabit the character they are playing in order to engage with the role play. But they also must accept that their choices are arbitrarily restricted. They are not free to add any input to the game that they choose, to interact with it how they choose. The player must engage with the knowledge that they are being given imperfect and partial control over their identity within the game, or the game will be unavoidably unfulfilling. And at the same time, they must identify with the character that they are role-playing, such that when the consequences of their actions come home to that character, an emotional reaction is invoked. So sorry, everyone, it is audience participation time. I promise I'll make this as painless as possible. Has anyone here been playing an RPG, any kind, not just text adventure, and selected a dialogue option only to be disappointed and jarred when you realize that you accidentally selected a tone way different to the one you expected? You thought you were being direct. Oh no, it's the harsh option. I'm angry at this person. I didn't mean to be. Oh, I've picked the honest option. Oh, this is sarcastic. Everybody hates me now. Who's had that experience? Yep. Oh yeah. It's kind of disquieting, right? Like the game has just broken a contract. You were willing to accept the game's restrictions as part of the necessity of it being a game, that you're not having someone respond to you in real time. You knew your options were limited, but in return, you were promised that you could choose freely between available options, and you could choose the way that the path that your character took with full knowledge and within those options. When your image of an option and the designer's clash, it creates a friction that momentarily disturbs the gameplay experience. So I created a game where that friction is the main gameplay interaction. The gameplay in Talk to Me starts off honoring this contract, and I've brought a section up on the screen. I'll just leave it there for people to read while I talk. Starts off honoring this contract, providing direct responses with clear explanations of the consequences. So you think you've recognized someone and your options are, oh, that's one of the options you can choose is that's Rumi. You both came here when you were kids. You smile and greet her. You are thinking it's good to see her. This is directly telling the player what they want in this situation. However, as you interact with the characters, there is a hidden meter, which is called the connections meter. The more that the player answers truthfully, the more that they ask other characters about themselves, the more they opt into attending social gatherings, the more that they choose to open themselves up and interact with the world around them, the more points they gain and the more that meter fills. However, the more they avoid telling other characters about themselves, the more they turn down opportunities to ask questions, the more they refuse to attend gatherings, the more they close themselves off from other characters, the more points they lose, the meter empties. As I said, the meter is at all times hidden to the player, and the player is given no cues about whether certain actions filled the meter, reduced the meter, or had no effect at all. After a certain point, if the connections meter is above a certain level, the dialogue options progressively misrepresent the player's intentions. So this is after that point in the game. Selecting that first option, that's Rumi. If your connections meter is high, you're presented with this joking response that the character gives, to which the other player, to which the NPC immediately takes offense. What's that supposed to mean? You know, the implication being like, your character has moved away. Did you expect this character to move away as well? Like, are you implying that you've made it and she hasn't? All of which is not indicated or intended in that dialogue option offered to the player. This is a very blunt, as I said, this is all prototypes. This is a very blunt instrument way of doing it, but it does provide a good example. At first, the options are potentially innocent, alternate interpretations of the same sentence, as here, where the player meant one thing, clearly meant one thing, and the NPC misinterprets that intent. But by the end of the game, the dialogue options will all but outright lie about what the player will say in response to selecting a specific dialogue option. However, if the meter is low, if you have chosen to shut yourself off, the characters around the player also become more standoffish, offering less information about themselves, inviting the player to fewer gatherings. You can end up actually locking yourself out of a significant portion of the gameplay experience if you choose not to open up and expose yourself to this kind of misinterpretation. For the prototype, this is a relatively simple and simplistic design. Game has an introduction, establishment scene, consequences scene, but I do believe that the prototype so far is enough to demonstrate the core idea of the project. I had one person come back to me with the comment that, like most text adventure games, you want to go in thinking about how to win the game. You want to figure out how to get the best outcome at the start of this maze. You want to find the way out of the maze. However, as I played, it became more and more clear that this maze has no exits. That is, by deliberately breaking the contract of the game, by deliberately opening up the players to the discomfort of being persistently, and some might say maliciously, misunderstood, the game is also creating the circumstances for the player to reassess their engagement with the game. By forcing the players to second guess what their choices might actually mean in the context of the system, but by having no concrete translation possible between input and response, the game forces the player to embody a state of uncomfortable uncertainty. This echoes many queer experiences, the experience of the trans man girl moding in places where it is unsafe to be out and unsure of how well he is passing, of the trans egg navigating social expectations that feel wrong in ways they do not yet have language to explain, the lesbian navigating her attraction to women in a society that does not provide milestones for relationships that do not involve marriage or having naturally conceived children, or even a social script for the expected roles and mechanics of dating when both partners are the same gender. This is not obviously the first game to use this kind of deliberate uncertainty and displacement in order to express queerness, queer experiences, and queered experiences. Queerness, as we've talked about in previous panels, has extensive entanglement with the horror genre as both deliberate discomfort in order to shine light on truths and in order to express experiences. The Missing, J.J. Macfield and the Island of Memories is an example, a game which is deliberately and painful, in which the main character breaks and reforms herself in order to express the experience of remaining true to oneself and one's goals in a world that opposes those goals. Depression Quest uses its mechanics to express experience as well, but for an experience of mental health rather than gender or sexuality. For example, the options that the players have the players have locked themselves out of appear in your options in Depression Quest, but they are struck out and unable to be selected. You are constantly confronted with the options that you are unable to take. Queer people also have a strong history of identifying and engaging with monsters and villains in fiction, seeing themselves reflected in the abnormal and that which is framed in opposition to society and to categorization. I should note as well that queerness is not the only thing that can be read into this game. It could also be very easily read as a response to my experiences as a late diagnosed neurodivergent person, or any number of alternate experiences that may reflect the player's experiences of being at a loss in a world that seems determined to miscommunicate with them. So where from here? In the coming months, I'll be turning this into a full project, fleshing out the game into its full experiences, giving it a smoother experience, a more dynamic one, where there is more, rather than being a sudden shift from one state to another, there's more of a meandering path. I'll be seeking ethics approval to conduct wider playtests in order to collect a range of responses beyond just the people I'm personally on good enough terms with to beg them for a couple of hours in order for me to deliberately upset them. I hope to be able to make more specific and detailed comments, especially on the experience of non-queer people playing the game versus queer people playing the game, and of the effectiveness of this kind of mechanical defamiliarization in conveying meaning to the player. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. Everybody have a good rest of your day.